Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching.
Good afternoon from the Nanovic Institute for European Studies here at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Clemens Sedmak and I serve as director of this institute. The Nanovic Institute for European Studies has been established to build bridges between our university and Europe. We have been founded to explore current issues in European studies and developments in Europe. The era of peace in Europe has been disrupted with the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th. We find ourselves in a world that is very much different from the world that we had seen in 1989, for those of us old enough to remember. I was in my last high school year, and I vividly remember my history teacher saying, "We live in truly historic times." The passing of Mikhail Gorbachev on August 30th has revived memories of glasnost, perestroika, and the hopes for one free world that were raised by his turn toward openness and reform. Moving scenes of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, a literal cutting of the Iron Curtain, were followed by a phase of enthusiasm for democracy and a smaller world. The end of the Cold War was celebrated in many countries. Many of us will remember the Aufbruchsstimmung of that time. Over 30 years later, in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, humanity finds itself in a very different space. Just today, we are faced with a new escalation of the war in Ukraine. We learn of widespread Russian strikes in Ukraine, and we learn that the leader of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, has ordered his troops to deploy with Russian forces near Ukraine. A colleague from our partner university, the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, wrote an email just a few minutes ago saying, We had a difficult day today, no electricity, almost no connection. But my family, students, and faculty are okay. Thanks God. We have to go through this and win. Are we in the middle of a new Cold War? Do the crisis of 2022 cast Mikhail Gorbachev and the period in which he led the Soviet Union in a different light? Do they reshape interpretations of the Cold War, how it ended, or even raise the question of whether it did end? Is there hope for a less divided world? These are the questions that we want to explore in our 1-hour virtual panel. I'm very grateful to our 4 distinguished panelists who will help us navigate this topic. I will very briefly introduce them in the order of speaking. Serhii Blochy is Mikhailo Kruzhevsky Professor of Ukrainian History and Director of the Ukrainian Research Institute, Harvard University. I think you're highlighting Slavomir and not Serhii.
We just lost him.
Oh, we lost him. So I will introduce him in his absence. His research interests include intellectual, cultural, international history of Eastern Europe, with an emphasis on Ukraine. He teaches courses and seminars on early modern and modern East European history and engaged major problems in the history of Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, Poland, and Lithuania. I want to mention 2 books, The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine, and The Last Empire, The Final Days of the Soviet Union. Welcome, Serhii. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon.
Well, thank you very much, Clemens, for this introduction, and thank you very much for organizing this panel. And
thank you, Serhii. I just introduced the other panelists and then give the word to you, if I may. Thank you, Serhii.
Sure, thank you.
Our second panelist, Christina Feinberg. She's a senior lecturer in modern history in the Department of International Politics from the City University of London. Dina's research focuses on modern Russian history, with a particular emphasis on Cold War culture, mass media and propaganda, late socialism, and Russia's relationship with the world. Dina, thank you so much for joining us from London. Welcome to the panel. Slavomir Lukasiewicz is a political scientist and professor at the John Paul II Catholic University of Lublin. He's also a visiting scholar at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University and a Kosciuszko Foundation grantee in 2022. He's joining us from Cambridge. Slavomir, thank you so much and welcome to our panel. Tobias Boes is Professor of German Studies and Department Chair in the German and Russian Languages and Literature Department here at Notre Dame. It is also, I'm proud to say, a faculty fellow here at the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. He donated the idea for this panel, and for this and for many other things, we are very grateful. Tobias, thank you for being with us this afternoon and for joining the panel.
Thank you, Clemens.
Each panelist will offer an input of about 8 minutes. After that, we will have time to engage with questions and comments. Our esteemed audience can submit questions using a button located on the Nanovic event webpage. Please make use of the Google form to ask questions. So again, welcome all. And please, dear Serhii, if I could please give the floor to you. Thank you. Serhii, are you still with us?
I think he may be having internet troubles.
Yeah, that's not good.
About to rethink what actually has been happening in the region of the former Soviet Union in the last
Serhii, we have connection problems. You are frozen and we cannot hear you. I'm very sorry about that. Let's give it a few seconds, and otherwise, Dina, I would have to ask you to jump in. Let's just wait a few seconds whether Serhii is coming back. Grania, could you please send a message to Serhii that we have lost him? And I'm afraid we have to wait for Serhii's contribution, or the worst case, in the worst case, have to forego his contribution. So I would then ask Dina, please, from London, where the connection is better, to offer your contribution to the panel. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you very much, Clemens and the Nanovic Center, for inviting me to take part in this event and for the opportunity to reflect on Mikhail Gorbachev's achievements and legacies. So I'm an historian of Soviet media and foreign affairs, and will address the intersection between these two spheres in my remarks. The Soviet media was assigned a crucial role in Gorbachev's reform of domestic and foreign affairs. A new information policy, glasnost, openness, called for increased government transparency and public discussion of the nation's problems. The architects of perestroika hoped that by exposing systemic shortcomings and scrutinizing officials, the press would highlight targets for improvement and mobilize public support for rejuvenating the socialist project. In coverage of foreign affairs, Soviet press was to offer new perspective on the Soviet Union's relationship with the world. Overall, glasnost was intended to impress upon domestic audiences and foreign observers the sincerity of Gorbachev's commitment to reform and bolster the credibility of his new thinking. Gorbachev's information policies were unprecedented in scope and nature. Glasnost soon superseded its original mandate, resulting in far-reaching liberalization of the Soviet media and information. Newspapers eventually came to reject the notion of forbidden topics, and censorship of the press was abolished within a few years. This change gave way to a radical transformation of Soviet journalistic practices. There was a flourishing of investigative reporting. Things that were previously prohibited from publication now became public. Journalists began to uncover accidents, calamities, corruptions, and criminal cooperation. Glasnost also liberated historical writing to shed light on the problems of the past, to acknowledge previously hidden historical facts, and question the historical arguments at the foundations of the Soviet regime. Thanks to glasnost, personal histories of terror and repression were no longer a dark past that needed to be hidden, but a part of the national history. Films and books that had been banned and censored for years, for example, Gulag Archipelago, were now published and read in the open for the first time. New films, books, and reports exploring honestly the uncomfortable truth of past and present came out. Gorbachev era was marked by this palpable sense of excitement as new and previously forbidden information came out every day. Soviet newspapers and magazines were snatched from the shelves as soon as they came out of print. Films and TV programs gathered million-strong audiences. I don't want to argue that glasnost brought down the Soviet Union, but I am convinced that it played an important role in the disintegration of the Soviet Empire. Glasnost shattered the popular perceptions of the Soviet project and many of the narratives that held it together. When the time came, many people didn't bother to prevent Soviet Empire's disintegration because they thought it was not worth saving. Gorbachev and his team also expanded Soviet outreach to the foreign press, hoping to mobilize Western public opinion and governments to engage with Soviet initiatives. Gorbachev's personality and Polish worldliness made him better equipped to deal with foreign media than any of his predecessors. Within a short time, his popularity in the West was so great that it had its own nickname, Gorbimania. Initially, observers in Europe and the United States were reluctant to trust Gorbachev. Many suspected that his foreign relations programs were a pretense or propaganda stint. They looked at how serious he was about reforming his own country, and glasnost in the press were the areas where they looked hardest. For many years, observers in the West believed that a closed society with tightly controlled flows of information was the main marker of the Soviet communist dictatorship. Yet others were convinced that if the Soviets would be given a chance at freedom of information, they would reject socialist regime. To foreign observers, new information policies and USSR's gradual opening to foreign press came to indicate that Gorbachev was serious about reforming the Soviet Union and willing to open new avenues of knowledge about the world. This understanding paved the way for diplomatic and mental processes that we now associate with the end of the Cold War. An information reform of this scale was bound to have a detrimental effect and an eventual backlash at home. Abandoning all restrictions on information over a very short period of time in a society that had never had any freedom of information began a downward spiral. Soviet society did not have the tools to process so much new information, so many challenging topics, and a simultaneous undermining of so many national narratives, which had given people personal meaning. There was reluctance and unwillingness to acknowledge certain subjects, for example, the national aspirations of Union republics or the conduct of Soviet troops in World War II. And the emotional resistance to these subjects and the correspondent sense of wounded national pride began to develop already during Gorbachev's time in power. And over the years, and unfortunately with proper nourishment, these emotions grew strong and gave birth to disastrous ideologies. I want to pause here and to underscore that part of the challenge was both the pace and the scale of information reforms, both very rare in modern history. Even in democracies with long traditions of a free press, there were taboo topics that took time to unveil, and discussion of certain subjects evolved gradually. As someone who is based in Britain, the topics of empire or the royal family come to mind. The process of dismantling glasnost began a long time ago and is beyond our scope here. But the war in Ukraine both shattered what remained of glasnost and mocked its legacy. The cleanup of media sphere began already before the war. Within a week of Russian invasion, all non-state controlled media had been forced to shut down. Many of these media, like Echo Moskvy or Novaya Gazeta, were established during glasnost and in its spirit. Many journalists have left the country, often under threat of arrest. Several journalists are in prison for quote unquote tarnishing the reputation of Russian troops with very long sentences. The list of foreign agents is updated weekly, and once a person is on the list, they can no longer speak on mainstream media and are unlikely to appear in public. Many of the journalists who came of age professionally during glasnost are now labeled as foreign agents and broadcasting in exile. Yet others populate the official state media channels and constitute the ugly face of Putin's propaganda war. Our news cycle makes it hard to be optimistic about Mikhail Gorbachev's legacy or its future. But one of the best things about our profession is that we come in daily contact with young people, and these interactions remind me to look for a silver lining in every dark situation. So what keeps me hopeful is that there are journalists and media, both inside and outside Russia, that still cherish the legacy of glasnost and are genuinely committed to freedom of information. Thank you.
Dina, you are muted.
No, I finished. Thank you.
Oh, apologies. I was just, thank you for that. What happened was Serhi told me that his internet connection is still unstable, and so he will go last. And so thank you for your insightful points about the trust building. I was thinking about how Putin lost trust and Gorbachev was trying to gain trust. And the question of the information reforms in both pace and scale in 1899 and where we are now. Thank you, Dina. That means we will move now to the Polish voice, which is Sławomir. Sławomir, political scientist from your university, would you please go next and offer your contribution? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clemens, first of all, for invitation, and it is my pleasure to be here. So let's say the conditions are not very pleasant around us, especially if you are looking at this war in Ukraine, which provokes really important questions. And this question which you've asked, I've heard many times, even for the last 3 years, and I will try to refer to this as well. My point of view, my perspective is somehow framed by what Zbigniew Brzezinski, former advisor to President Carter, tried to say generally about a conflict which was called the Cold War. And I will try to answer to 5 other questions, starting with the first one, simply, what was the Cold War? Of course, we know that it was bipolar world divided between two of the most powerful players. It is important that we had some frozen conflicts but we had also hot proxy wars, which really happened. We had also arms race with nuclear deterrence doctrine, but we had also conflict of values and conflict of different attitudes towards such basic freedoms like individual freedom, religious freedom, freedom of speech, in regards to the role of state, and many other issues. And for this purpose, some unusual warfare was used, like, for example, exiles, which is my specialty. I could tell a few words more, but it is not the good moment for this. But also so-called psychological warfare and many such things, also mentioned by Dina. Yes, when journalism was supported also from the West. So this glasnost opened a new space for this. The second question I'm asking myself, and is provoked by this panel, is why we said that Cold War ended. And of course, it was confirmed by the dissolution of the Soviet bloc and the dissolution of the Soviet state itself. And Gorbachev, which is in the title of this panel, was the Soviet leader who wanted to amend the system. We should remember this. He didn't want to dissolve Soviet Union. He wanted to amend the system and to adjust it to somehow better standards. But simply the state didn't respond as he wanted, and eventually collapsed. And in effect, we had a situation when in the 90s, we had the United States of America. It was the only state capable to control many things all over the world. It was this period of hegemony. And simply were not able to talk more about Cold War. Yes, we had no reasons for this. And moreover, I mean the West, but also states like Poland in Central Europe from this post-Soviet region, we wanted to believe that Russian state is and should be a normal democratic state, approving democratic standards and, first of all, international law. And moreover, both Gorbachev and later Yeltsin, they somehow guaranteed such developments. They were reliable for us as the leaders. Yes, we believed them and we wanted to believe. If we're looking at the world, I have the third question: what went wrong? And I think that our belief in Russia's change and goodwill simply overshadowed ambitions of Putin and some other leaders who replaced Gorbachev and Yeltsin. We have to remember also that Russian authorities are still today very strongly connected with former KGB, with this sector of called in Russian Siloviki, as this special type of trained officers of state apparatus, and they systematically reverse the direction of internal reform and over to control of the state. It is for a separate discussion, but it happened during the last 2 decades for sure. But they prepared also ideologically motivated reversion of international order. We can mention nationalism, borrowed from Solzhenitsyn. We can mention Eurasianism with Dugin as the example, but we can say also something about imperialism, which refers to the old history of Russia. And with this contesting of international order, Russia contested also will of neighboring nations and countries to stay independent. And we have many examples, not only Ukraine today, but it was Chechnya, the part of Russia which wanted to be independent, yes, but eventually it ended in war as well. Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus, yes. So in this post-Soviet sphere, Russia was very, very active for years. What is different in current situation if we are comparing this with Cold War? First of all, Russia is not the only country which wants to undermine post-war rules of international system. China is the great example, and this is why when I came here 3 years ago, I remember very hard discussions about so-called Second Cold War. But Second Cold War meant rivalry between the United States of America and China. Not, let's say, coming back to this Cold War like we had before 1989. So let's say the world is a little bit more complicated. We have also very strong shift in technology with such possibilities like Facebook revolutions. I will not mention them all, yes, but farms of trolls, which are very active, and Dina could say more probably about this, especially in information warfare. They are very dangerous, and we should react to this as well. We cannot ignore this. And Putin is testing also some other new types of warfare, like energy dependence, hybrid war, which we saw 8 years ago, information war, nuclear blackmail. Yes, we can also count a lot of different things which are happening now. And eventually he decided to use conventional war against Ukraine, simply for territorial expansion, what looks like, let's say, 19th century strategy of Russian state. And also, we should add that Putin is not so strong like Stalin in, for example, 40s or 50s, when Stalin was very strong after purges he made within Bolshevik apparatus in the 30s, when he was very strong after the Second World War, and when Soviet Union was totally isolated from world ties. Russia is not isolated from world ties. Still, information can get Russia. Still, we see processes which are not possible in Soviet Union. You know, such a wave of Russian migrants who are reaching today the world was not possible then. Okay, and can we call the current situation a Cold War, new or old? For Ukraine, it is a hot war. It is resembling something like Polish Bolshevik War in 1920, when Polish army stopped not only annexation of territories, but simply Soviet march to the west. We can compare Putin, of course, not only to Stalin, but we can compare him to Khrushchev. Probably said we can tell more about this. We can compare him also with Hitler. Yes, because of many things. So Putin is something new, and it is very difficult to say that we have strictly the Cold War like in the 60s or 70s, and we don't know the future. Yes, I will not go further. So in conclusion, what I would like to say, the Cold War lasted for years, because no one was strong and determined enough to wage the war further and after the defeat of Hitler. In consequence, Stalin's and Soviet crimes were never punished, even though revealed, like Dina said. Even Gorbachev was not able to break this vicious circle, and Putin is not interested in this at all. Moreover, he is adding the new crimes to the list, probably with hope that no one will punish him, as it was in Stalin's case. And I can say at the end that the Cold War climate is back, for sure. But the Brzezinski's great chessboard evolved during the last decades, and the new game plan is necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Slavomir, for reminding us of, well, who said that the Cold War ever ended? Talk about the new situation, which is more complex, with China and others being in the picture, the new technological innovations, and the new forms of warfare, including nuclear blackmail and the energy blackmail. For Ukraine, it's a hot war, and you concluded with the Cold War climate, especially back. Thank you. Slavomir, we move now to campus. Tobias Boers from German Studies will share his views now. Tobias, thank you so much.
Thank you, Clemens. So I'm a literature and cultural studies scholar, not a historian or political scientist. So I want to talk today not about Gorbachev, the man, or about even the Cold War, but rather I want to talk about the perception that Germans nowadays still have of Mikhail Gorbachev and why that might be important to our present situation in 2020. So Dina already gave the important term of Gorbimania into the discussion, and the Germans are certainly the epicenter of Western Gorbimania, that is of Western enthusiasm for Mikhail Gorbachev. It's probably safe to say that no other foreign politician of the 20th century, not even John F. Kennedy, is held in as great a regard in the German-speaking world as Mikhail Gorbachev. And that, to briefly recap, has four main reasons, I would say. Number one, Gorbachev refused to crush the popular uprisings in the late 1980s in Eastern Europe by military force. Number two, he essentially withdrew Soviet support from the moribund East German regime, which was a necessary step leading up to the fall of the wall. Number three, he peacefully withdrew Soviet troops from Eastern Germany. And number four, he allowed Germany to reunify, which was certainly not a given back in 1990. And certainly from the Soviet perspective must have been a really big step to take that was opposed by many hardliners. And for that, especially the German people to the present day continue to be extremely grateful to Mikhail Gorbachev, so that when he passed away, if you looked at the German press, there was a lot of very heartfelt eulogies, a lot of nostalgia for him, a lot of mourning, basically. And it's easy to make fun of that or to mock that if we take a more global view and we look at the much more complicated legacy of Mikhail Gorbachev in the former Soviet Union. But I think, nostalgia and a certain amount of utopianism are powerful forces that we shouldn't discount or shouldn't underestimate. But I think it's also true that if you dig a little bit deeper beneath that veneer of nostalgia, you quickly get to some more problematic strata, and you realize that Gorbachev's greatest achievements, in a sense, are now 30 years later, proving to be perhaps much more complicated for the Germans as well. So the first thing that I want to highlight is that the fact that Gorbachev, or that people had such a universally positive perception of Gorbachev, meant that the history of the Cold War was never really fully worked through in the way that it perhaps should have been. It was easy for people in the 1990s to blame all the evils of what had happened in East Germany on the East German government without also critically reflecting on the role that the Soviet Union had played in that, because after all, East Germany was a vassal state in the Soviet Empire. And that, looking forward, has, I think, led to many German politicians also underestimating developments in Russia since 1990, and specifically underestimating Putin, because people had such a positive view of Gorbachev. Politicians like Angela Merkel or the former German president Frank-Walter Steinmeier, I think, were very slow to catch on that a more critical, a more nuanced take of what was going on in Russia was perhaps necessary. You see that, I think, to the most extreme on the leftermost edge of the political spectrum, with the Socialist Party in Germany, Die Linke, which essentially was able to draw a double line under GDR history and distance itself from the GDR without having to distance itself from the socialist project as a whole. I think in part because of that sense that everything worked out well with Russia in the end, after all. And that, I think, is one of the reasons my students are always surprised to hear this, that on the extreme German left, there is a lot of support for Putin, which I think is routed through this unexamined relationship with Russia. But also, if you turn to the far right, if you ask yourself in present-day Germany, where is the strongest support for Putin, actually? It's not on the far left, although, as I said, the support there exists too. It's largely on the far right, and it's amongst especially the populist movements, the kinds of people who several years ago went to the street to protest against vaccine mandates and mandatory masking, and who are now back on the street protesting against what they regard the dangers of a winter without Russian gas. And if you look at those people, they oftentimes stylize themselves as the successors of the civil rights movements of 1989, 1990. And if you have that self-perception, if you think of yourself as being in that legacy, then Gorbachev, I think, becomes important for you as a figure of the good government leader, the kind of leader who emblematizes what a government response should be, should look like. Glasnost and perestroika, for those kinds of people, are easily applicable to present-day circumstances where they also think we're being ruled by technocrats who are feeding us a lot of lies, there's a lot of obfuscation. We need to cut through all that. And I think Gorbachev is an interesting figure on which to fix those hopes and projections. And I think it's telling that one of the most important sources of political disinformation coming from the far right in Germany right now is a website run by a journalist named Boris Reitschuster, who is a Russia expert and actually is the translator of Gorbachev's memoirs into German, and is a Gorbachev expert. And shortly after Gorbachev passed away, he posted a tribute to Gorbachev on his blog. And what I found interesting was that there's sort of a poison pill contained in that tribute, in that after praising Gorbachev as this sort of visionary leader, he also alludes to the fact that, oh, maybe there was this plan in Moscow during the 1990s to prop up KGB stooges in the German Federal Chancellery to do Soviets' bidding. And although he doesn't spell it out explicitly, he's of course referring to Angela Merkel in that sense. So that is an example of somebody quite explicitly using the memory of the still positively connotated memory of Mikhail Gorbachev for quite nefarious ends. And I think that is that's a sad development, but it's one that I think we'll have to watch in the coming years as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tobias, for reminding us of the Gorbimania in Germany. I also vividly remember that. And then this point about history of the Cold War has never been fully worked through. And then we paid a bill for that with a certain naivety when it comes to judging contemporary developments or any time after Putin, including now your final point about the danger of abusing Gorbachev's memory for political propaganda or disinformation purposes. Thank you. Maybe, Sergei, we try again, and then let's see whether your connection is strong enough. Please, may I give the word to you?
Sure. And thank you very much for your patience and for accommodating me. I hope the connection will be okay and fine. Again, it was a pleasure to listen to these presentations. Really, the death of Gorbachev in August of this year is an opportunity for us to look back at what was happening then and maybe reassess that in light of what we are living through these days. My personal interpretation of the Russo-Ukrainian war and the all-out attack of Russia on Ukraine in February of this year is that we are facing the war that really the seeds of which, the roots of which are in the fall and disintegration of the Soviet Union. The disintegration of the Soviet Union really didn't come to an end with Gorbachev's speech on December 25th, 1991. But that was the time when that disintegration really started in earnest. And it's not over yet, and it's not over in Ukraine, it's not over in Russia and in the post-Soviet space in general. The Gorbachev's figure in this context acquires, of course, a special meaning. He left really lasting legacy in many ways. Some of his initiatives didn't produce results he hoped for. Others, on the other hand, continue to define the world of today. One of them is that Gorbachev was able to successfully maneuver the Communist Party out of power in the Soviet Union. His personal vision was some form of social democracy and social democratic party. His rise to power was very closely associated with the fact that he was a big believer in Lenin, or at least a big expert on Lenin. That what brought him and Andropov together. And what we can see today is that the communist project certainly is pretty much over, in not just in Russia, but in the post-Soviet space as a whole. And that is certainly one of the legacies of Gorbachev and his rule. Another legacy of his is, of course, the presidential power in today's Russia and the post-Soviet republics in general. By maneuvering the party out of power, Gorbachev really made it impossible anymore to continue with any form of so-called collective leadership of the sort that was established after Stalin, that was practiced for some period of time under Kosygin and then under Brezhnev. And the start and the beginning of the enormous power of Putin is really in the transformations that were undertaken by Gorbachev in the late 1980s, with establishing the Institute of Presidency. With one of the ideas is really to free and liberate him as a reformer from the control of the Politburo and control of the collective leadership as such. Gorbachev really is the father of glasnost, or at least one of the fathers. Another important person in all that story was, of course, Alexander Yakovlev, who is sometimes called grandfather of perestroika. And what glasnost was basically an attempt to liberalize the media, while still maintaining control, first of the party and then of the presidential office over what was going on there. So the glasnost was an extremely important development that really started the process of the transformation and then disintegration of the Soviet Union. It was also a version of a sovereign democracy, in a sense, of a kind of the liberalization that would be still controlled by the center. Gorbachev, in that sense, again, it's very important to keep in mind that he belonged in many ways to the generation of the 1960s. And for them and for him personally, the ideas of the Prague Spring, the ideas of the communism or socialism with human face were extremely important. And in that sense, that's also another context in which we can and probably should place glasnost as part of Gorbachev's vision of the transformation. But glasnost pretty much comes to an end once Gorbachev himself loses control of what is happening in the media and what is happening in the society. And this is closely associated, even more than with glasnost, it's more closely associated with his belief in democracy. He believed that the economic transformation, the social transformation of the Soviet Union was impossible without some form of glasnost and without actually some form of democratization. Very different take from what Deng Xiaoping at that time, around the same time, is trying to do in China. And it is democratization and election, or semi-free and then relatively free elections to the Republican parliaments that leads to the fact that Gorbachev eventually loses control over the processes that are taking place in the Soviet Union, being completely blind to the fact that he became the leader of the imperial or post-imperial country, a multi-ethnic state, multinational state. He clearly believed that the nationality question was resolved either in Lenin's way or Lenin's form, or in Stalin's way or Stalin's form. One of his first mistakes was parachuting to Kazakhstan, an ethnic Russian from the Ural Mountains, basically completely breaking the deal that was formed after Stalin's death between the regional elites and the central elites. Gorbachev was caught by surprise. He didn't expect that kind of response, and eventually then tried to correct that. That's when Nazarbayev came to the fore, one of the long-lasting leaders of the post-Soviet space. Once the democratization was there, the freely elected parliament of Lithuania voted during their first day in session for independence of their republic. And that's where Gorbachev was faced with the choice: either you continue democratic reforms, and it's the nationalities that mobilize themselves first, or you really shut down the democracy process and democracy undertaking. He tried to do that the best he could by sending troops in early 1991 to the Baltic states and Baltic republics. He refused to use armed forces in Eastern Europe, but he certainly was prepared and was doing that in Georgia. He was doing that in the Baltic states, and eventually backed off because of pressure coming from the West. He was calling on the armed forces to defend him and defend the Soviet Union in December of 1991, but his call went unanswered. Which brings me to the topic of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, where the Gorbachev really, it's not just misunderstood, but the Gorbachev's legacy is being manipulated, in particular by the current leaders of Russia. Because they came out, including Putin and other group, they came out of Yeltsin's camp, who was really a very important force in the processes of disintegration of the USSR. When Gorbachev repeatedly not just stand, but tried to do whatever he could to save the Soviet Union, again, to save also his own position and his own political future. But at this point, in this very strange way of looking at the history, Gorbachev is presented by current leaders of Russia who benefited from his reform, who became the leaders of the country because of those reforms. He is presented as someone who either dissolved the Soviet Union or destroyed the Soviet Union. Certainly his reforms contributed to the process, but that was not his idea, that was not his vision. No matter how we look at the collapse of the Soviet Union as a positive or negative development in the region.
You're almost at time, Sergei.
Sorry?
You're almost at time, Sergei. Okay,
well, thank you. And let me then conclude with the question of what is next. One thing that Gorbachev's really contribution to the end of communism has shown was that Alexander Solzhenitsyn's view that the biggest problems in Russia and with Russia were because of the communism. We see that many elements that characterized Russian history before communism, including in particular the issues related to imperialism, to the Russian nationalism, and so on and so forth, they continue after the end of the Soviet Union, under the end of communism. We still have 30 years after Gorbachev, we have major issue, and this is understatement, with democratization. We are back to the situation of the use of military force in the neighborhoods of Russia. And we are talking about either return of the Cold War or the Cold War II, which also suggests that many challenges and many tasks that Gorbachev had when he started his reforms and policies, that the same challenges face us today. And this dive back into the history of Gorbachev's rule can be important not for us only as historians, but also as people who think about our today and the future of the world. Right. Thank you very much for it.
Thank you, Sergei. Thank you so much. You made many fascinating points. I just want to mention this point about the collapse of collective leadership that allowed Gorbachev to be the reformer. That, however, paved the way then for Putin's rise to power without any corrective behind him. We have about 12, 13 minutes for questions, and a few questions have come in already. Let me please start with a very simple question, which I would like to direct maybe to Slavomir. Could one of the panelists speak to Gorbachev's reputation with the average Russian citizen now? What's the reputation of Gorbachev with the average Russian citizen? Slavomir, what would you say?
I'm not sure that I am the best person who can answer this question.
I don't want to put you on the spot. I mean, you can say a few sentences and we ask them where we see. Dina. Should we move to Dina right away? Yeah, Dina, what's your connection?
I don't think there is an average Russian person. but I do think that Gorbachev has a very divided legacy, and it's much more ambivalent than the legacy that Tobias was talking about and that it is in the West. So there are people who, I was hearing a tribute to Gorbachev and somebody who belongs to kind of liberal, pro-Western, anti-war intelligentsia saying that Gorbachev's reforms were like being a patient in this decaying hospital ward, where patients are in coma and they don't even know they're in coma. And then kind of a new director to the hospital shows up and suddenly they have prospect of healing. So even if the beds are creaking and the doctors are terrible, that is still kind of a big change. And so he was kind of making this metaphor of kind of waking up from a coma for the first time. This is one interpretation, of course. And then, of course, then this other embodied no less in kind of implicitly in Putin's statements about the collapse of the Soviet Union, his unwillingness to attend the funeral and the events, and this is kind of another strain of blaming Gorbachev for quote unquote the greatest tragedy of modern history and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so kind of between these two kind of poles, there are many different opinions and senses in between, but again, it is a contested, it is an ambivalent legacy.
Thank you, Dina. A question for Serhii, if I may. The question is, in my opinion, Russian foreign policy and discourse right now has more resemblance with Stalin era Soviet imperialist policies and discourse rather than Gorbachev and Khrushchev era. Would you consider this true, and that Russia has reversed back to its 20th century state?
Clemens, the question is for me?
Yes, it's for you, please, Serhii.
Okay, sure. Well, I basically agree with the statement part of that question, in a sense that both rhetorically and in terms of the actions, there is much more in common between, let's say, especially late Stalinism and today than it is between Khrushchev and Gorbachev. If you look at the rhetorical side of those things, Khrushchev is certainly a big believer in communism, and that's the rhetoric. The class war, the class struggle, the world revolution when it comes to Cuba is very much part of his thinking. Gorbachev certainly starts as a true Leninist and then evolves toward social democratic and liberal thinking and models about the world. When you look at Putin, this is a flashback to the Russian imperial thinking, policies, and narrative. His historical essay or pseudo-historical essay that was published last year and served as a launching pad ideologically for the current war states that Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people, which is taking a page directly from the Russian imperial repertoire of the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, when the official line and the belief was that Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, or Russians, Little Russians, and White Russians were one and the same people. And you see the same to a different degree in Stalin, where the ideas of Leninism and class struggle and Marxism take a backseat to the ideas of pan-Slavic idea and some forms of Russian nationalism, and return to the international scene, at least the Russian Orthodox Church as a weapon, as an instrument of the state. So yes, I certainly agree with that premise.
Thank you, Serhii. Slavomir, may I try to direct a question to you? And the question is, a recent Nanovic flash panel focused on the role of diplomacy in the war in Ukraine. And the question is, to what extent do you think that the drawing clear distinctions between the Cold War and post-Cold War period on the part of world leaders, diplomats, and others help explain the way in which Western democracy has responded to Russian aggression over recent decades? In other words, and that's the question, very simply put, do you believe that believing we were in a post-Cold War era led to complacency as regards to protecting and defending democracy? And you mentioned this point about whoever thought that the Cold War has ended. So Slavomir, do you think that we were too naive and complacent in the way we looked at the end of the Cold War?
I was muted. If I can say a few words, we can distinguish between different actors. Yes, and I think that some leaders and some states were maybe too naive, but they wanted also, as I said, to believe in this goodwill of Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Putin, and all the leaders. Yes, to the changes. What Tobias said was very important. For example, for Germans, yes, they wanted to believe in this because it was a part of the culture, of the understanding of the changes, and we cannot deny this. From the other side, if you are looking at Polish history, yes, we had a lot of different historical experiences which didn't allow us to believe in true intentions of Putin, and we observed very carefully what is going on inside Russia. As I said, how the whole system, how this whole state is changing, and many things happened when we supported, for let's say, Euromaidan, when we supported different elements of Ukrainian revolution, but also Belarusian, also Georgian, and so on. So what I do not want to say that, let's say, we are very strongly different from Germans, because when it was something at Maidan in Kiev, both, let's say, Polish and German ministers went there. Yes, when there was Eastern Partnership proposed by European Union, it was Polish and Swedish initiative, supported also by German side. And what is very unique, and I will finish with this, is current, I think, very strong message sent by Josep Borrell as the chief of European diplomacy toward Putin. Unbelievable, I think, before the war, before this, because everyone wanted diplomacy, and everyone saw that diplomacy failed, and now it's time for new measures.
Thank you, Slavomir. I have a question for Tobias, sorry. I will merge three questions, and that's why I just improvise a little bit. It's about the relationship between personality and politics. So you mentioned Gorbi Mania in Germany, and we had Angela Merkel as a towering figure in German politics. And now we are fixated on the role of individuals like Zelensky and Putin. We know that there is a connection between trusting in a person and having confidence in a system. And Dina talked about the importance of trust building that Gorbachev had to do. Do you think that this close connection, Tobias, between personality and politics is healthy? And what would be good alternatives?
No, I don't think it's healthy. I mean, you just said that we have research that makes us believe that when people put trust in personalities, they also put trust in institutions. Again, I'm not a political scientist, but I would say that the experience of the last few years has proven exactly the opposite. Because, of course, the way that populist leaders the world over work is they try to cultivate trust in personalities precisely to attack the institutions, right? To attack legislative bodies, to attack courts, and in order to secure sole power for themselves, for the executive, essentially. And so that's why I'm very mistrustful of narratives that are based on trust in individual political leaders. At the same time, though, I sometimes, I come in touch with Gorbachev in the classroom when I teach students about developments in Germany since the fall of the wall. I teach a regular class on that topic, and so at the beginning we start in the first few weeks. We start by discussing the fall of the wall. And we also start by discussing Gorbachev. And I had the idea for this panel because Gorbachev happened to die at the precise same moment that I was talking about him. Yep. Every year when I teach that particular lesson, it occurs to me what a big part of my own personal political development, the events of 1989, 1990 were. I was 13, 14 years old at the time, and it was really a sort of a generational moment. And it occurs to me that our students have grown up in an age of sort of unending cynicism towards politicians. Yeah. So I'm very divided. On the one hand, analytically, I understand the dangers of that kind of reverence, but I also worry that we have nothing in its place.
Thank you. Thank you, Tobias. Friends, we're almost at time. So what we'll do now is I will give one final sentence to each panelist. I know this is cruel, but that's what we will do. One final sentence. We'll start with Serhii, ask Dina, then Slavomir and Tobias. Serhii, just one final sentence, please.
Yeah, I just want to confess that Gorbachev and Gorbachev reforms really was a major part of my own life and life-changing experience in more than one way. And certainly he was one of the great leaders of the 20th century.
Thank you, Serhii. Dina, your last sentence.
I want to echo what Tobias said, that when I teach Gorbachev, I can't let go of the idea of somebody who was decent and hopeful and put forward ideas that are beautiful, and at the end of the day was willing to step down and did not cling to his chair at all costs. And I think especially in the last years, we're really missing this component in our politics, and that's maybe that's the way to combat the cynicism towards politics that our students have.
Thank you, Dina. Slavomir, your last sentence.
First of all, I would like to repeat what Serhii said here at Harvard a few days ago. It is the sentence which we are repeating in Poland very, very often, that the false history is the master of false politics. So first of all, you have to study history also of the Cold War. You have to work this out simply to know something wise about our world. And the second recommendation I have for the students who are listening to us, please read Zbigniew Brzezinski. Thank you.
Thank you, Slavomir. Thank you. Tobias, your last sentence.
I will just end by highlighting one achievement of Gorbachev's that we haven't talked about, which is the reduction in nuclear weapons, which I think is a reminder that Gorbachev, one of the things that made Gorbachev great was that he was able to think not just in national terms or think about his people or his ideological system of communism that he grew up in, but he was able to think in terms of mankind entire, and that is something that we will certainly need going forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Tobias. Thank you so much, dear panelists. Thank you, Serhii. Thank you, Dina. Thank you, Slavomir. Thank you, Tobias. We've learned a lot. Thank you, audience, for the questions. We also want to thank our colleagues who made this virtual panel possible, especially Tim Jackley, Grania McEvoy, Jen Lektansky, and Becca Prince. And we from the Nanovic Institute for European Studies here in Notre Dame want to wish you all a good and safe afternoon. Thank you so much.